When the scientific station Erebus in the very heart of Antarctica sent out a distress signal, no one paid much attention. In such conditions, equipment often malfunctions, and brief radio interference is nothing out of the ordinary. But this time, things were different. Before the connection was lost, a message was recorded, encrypted within the emergency protocol. It contained only a few words. Something discovered. Impossible to describe. After that, silence. The control center in Australia tried to re-establish contact, but the station never broadcast again. 24 hours later, an emergency response team was dispatched to the area. There were still about 48 hours left before the rescue team would arrive, and during all that time, rumors began to spread across the internet. Some mentioned seismic activity, while others claimed to have seen heavy machinery moving across the ice shelf. It all looked like ordinary panic. However, interest was fueled by the fact that access to information was suddenly restricted, and all posts mentioning the Erebus station began to disappear. When the rescue team arrived at the site, the station was empty. No signs of struggle, no evidence of a disaster. All the equipment was in working order. The food and water supplies were untouched, but there were no people, not even any tracks in the snow. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. The only thing they found was an encrypted archive on the main computer's hard drive. Inside it were files with the last modification date, 3 hours before the distress signal. The best specialists tried to figure out what was in them. However, even they couldn't explain one oddity. In the footage from the surveillance cameras placed around the station during the last several hours, no one entered or left. So how did the entire crew disappear? And while the experts argued about the nature of the disappearance, one of the operators noticed something strange in the distant background of one of the cameras, a movement beneath the surface of the ice. A huge shadow, as if slowly gliding under the station. At that time, no one yet understood what exactly they had caught on camera. But someone in a classified military department immediately began to take action. After all, something like this had happened once before. But not here, and not in our time. 6 days after the incident at the Erebus station, a network of seismic sensors scattered across Antarctica, as part of an international monitoring program, recorded a series of unusual tremors. They did not resemble standard tectonic shocks. These were slow, almost drawn-out tremors, intermittent, but with a clear logic to the intervals. Scientists called it the subglacial echo. The strangest thing was that the source of the signals was located in an area where previously only solid layers of ice and rock had been recorded. There were no voids or geothermal anomalies there. However, now these echo signals were repeating with a certain regularity, as if someone or something was moving. To verify this, satellite radars were brought in. And that's when the first data came in, which left even the most experienced geophysicist bewildered. At a depth of more than 2 miles beneath the surface, in the area of the subglacial depression, a shape could be seen that resembled an elongated body several dozen feet long, without clear outlines, but dense with internal structures. At first, it was assumed to be just an optical illusion. However, after 3 days, the shape began to change its position. The mass of ice around it shifted. That meant the object was not stationary. This was impossible. There are no conditions for movement there. The temperature is below -90, the pressure is off the charts, and there is zero oxygen access. But the shape was moving. After this discovery, the information was immediately classified. Independent scientists were removed from the research, and a team controlled by government agencies took their place. New terms appeared in the reports: anomalous body, unclassified biological mass, preliminary preservation. One of the scientists wrote in a personal blog that this was the greatest discovery since the dinosaurs. That blog was deleted 3 hours later, and the author himself suddenly left the project. Something was moving under the ice, and that something had a shape that science would have a hard time explaining. When information about the subglacial anomaly began to leak into scientific circles, one of the geologists working in a neighboring region of Antarctica decided to compare the coordinates with his own notes. 5 years ago, his team was drilling in the area of an ancient continental shelf that had been buried under ice tens of millions of years ago. At that time, they came across a large fragment of rock in which the silhouette of a bone structure could be discerned. According to preliminary estimates, it could have been part of a skull, but its size did not fit within the range of any known animals that inhabited Antarctic waters. At the time, the find was dismissed as a failed reconstruction. They said it was unclear what it was, most likely just an overlap of different rock layers. The artifact was sent to a secure storage facility in New Zealand and was forgotten. But now, in light of new data, the geologist has initiated a review of the materials. With the new analysis using three-dimensional tomography, it became clear this was not an overlap, but part of a massive skull. It had a depression beneath the eye, a powerful jaw arch, and a distinctive curve typical of Mesozoic predators. The most alarming thing was that the bone structure turned out to be denser than that of known dinosaurs, which indicated either an unusual lifestyle or a marine environment with extreme conditions. Such a skull could have belonged to a creature similar to a mosasaur but exceeding known sizes. The scientists were careful to avoid making bold statements, but internal reports already contained phrases like anomalously developed marine predator and unknown species from the Jurassic or Cretaceous period. When the coordinates of the find were compared with the anomalies under the ice, it turned out that they lay on the same geological line. And if this is the same organism, then we are dealing with a creature whose size could reach the length of a bus. But the question remained, how could such a creature have survived or even existed in modern times? To understand the nature of the discovery, a group of paleontologists began an urgent review of archival data on marine predators that lived millions of years ago. And the deeper they dug, the more parallels they found with real species that once existed, especially with one, the Leviathan melville. Leviathan was a giant predatory whale that lived about 10 million years ago. It had massive teeth over a foot long and rivaled the megalodon in ferocity. However, such discoveries had never been recorded in Antarctica, and this raised even more questions. Some fossil finds related to mosasaurs, marine reptiles up to 60 feet long, also suggested the possible distribution of these creatures throughout the southern hemisphere. Now imagine, if such species really did exist in those waters and a fossil was found in the area of their former habitat, could it be that one specimen somehow got trapped under the ice? Theoretically, yes. And similar ideas have been voiced in the scientific community before, not as fact, but as a hypothetical possibility. And now, a comparison. A scan of the ice mass revealed a structure resembling a vertebral column over 40 feet long. This figure fits exactly within the range of known giant predators. For now, it's just a shadow on the screen. But the coincidences were unsettling, especially when the shape began to shift. The team conducting the drilling in the subglacial depression encountered something unprecedented. The drill suddenly veered off course. It was as if it had struck something soft and dense, but not rock. Analysis of the extracted samples revealed a high organic content and traces of calcium, components typical of the remains of living organisms. After a series of samples, the decision was made to lower a probe with a camera into the shaft. The image received from a depth of more than 1.5 miles was blurry, but clearly showed something resembling the texture of skin. The skin had a rough, almost ridged surface like that of large marine reptiles. At the same time, cracks of an unusual shape appeared on the outer side of the ice dome just below the station. They looked like huge longitudinal grooves, as if someone or something had clawed at the ice. The size of these grooves exceeded 15 feet. No modern animal could have left such marks. It was decided to withdraw most of the team, but one of the engineers managed to take measurements and upload the data to an external server. This data was later studied by independent experts. One of them claimed that the structure of the ice in the area of the grooves was deformed from within, as if something massive was moving slowly beneath it. And that's when the first serious hypothesis emerged. Perhaps it's not just remains under the ice. Perhaps it is a creature submerged in a state of deep anabiosis. How is that possible? When the organic samples extracted from the ice shaft arrived at the laboratory, experts expected to see the typical picture for ancient fossils: destroyed cells, fragments of tissue, traces of mineralization. But what they discovered contradicted fundamental biological concepts. In some microscopic fragments, traces of collagen were found, a protein that very rarely survives for more than several tens of thousands of years, especially in the harsh environment of permafrost. Moreover, the tissues preserved distinct capillary structures and what outwardly resembled cell nuclei. This meant that the samples could be not millions, but at most tens of thousands of years old. Such a conclusion led to two explanations. Either this is a very recent biological material that somehow ended up in the deep layers of ice, which is almost impossible, or we are dealing with a unique phenomenon of preservation, in which organic matter could have survived in a frozen state for an incredibly long time. The scientific community was divided. Some spoke of a breakthrough, others of a forgery, and still others urged silence until the analysis was complete. But some of the data had already made its way online, either by mistake or intentionally. And among this data were photographs of tissue structures almost identical to those of large marine mammals. What does this mean? If we assume that what lies beneath the ice is not just a frozen predator from the Mesozoic, but a fragment of a preserved organism, then the most troubling question arises: could it have survived millions of years in a state of suspended animation? After the surge of activity around Erebus Station and the subglacial anomalies, the government suddenly restricted access to the region. All communication, satellite, radio, internet, was formally blocked for the duration of maintenance work. In reality, the area was put into complete isolation. Scientific teams from other countries who had previously been working nearby were urgently evacuated. At the same time, the official reason sounded absurd: the threat of ice collapse. However, geologists did not record any signs of instability. Moreover, independent researchers noted that, for some reason, scientific articles published in recent months related to the geology and biology of the Antarctic region were being removed. Journalists tried to find out more details, but no one responded to their inquiries. One popular blogger, known for his exposés, published a post with alleged satellite images of the area. An hour later, his account was deleted, and he himself claimed that he had made a mistake and deleted all the videos. Amidst this silence, specialists who had access to the project began to speak anonymously. One of them reported that he had seen part of a report about possible biological activity within the ice. Another mentioned that conditions might have been created for the organism that would allow for temporary reactivation of its cells. Yet another said that they did not find a body as such, only a trace, as if something had left the ice very recently. When silence becomes total, it always means that someone is afraid of noise. In order to verify all the incoming information, an independent group of researchers decided to create a three-dimensional map of the subglacial area using available satellite data, old scans, and calculations. What they reconstructed turned out to be unexpected. Beneath the Antarctic ice, there truly exists a system of tunnels and karst cavities connected to a network of underground lakes. The largest of these is Lake Vostok, which has long been known to science. However, there were unregistered formations found next to it. One of these was an elongated depression extending almost 2 miles deep, which had the shape of an almost vertical tunnel. At its bottom was a cave the size of a multi-story building. It was surrounded by dense ice and had its own heat source, likely of geothermal origin. Biologists had long suspected that such zones could support life, even if only microscopic. But now, the discussion was about a void that could theoretically accommodate a creature of colossal size. And if this cavity had somehow been connected to the ocean millions of years ago, a large animal could indeed have entered it, and given sufficient isolation and stable temperature, could have survived there. However, this was not the main discovery. Inside the cave, there was a structure resembling an imprint, huge, spiraled, with lines that looked like traces of muscles and skin. It was recorded at a depth of almost 3 miles, and on one of the scans, something shifted by literally 1.5 inches. The movement was detected by the instruments. Some people laughed, some reviewed the scans 10 times, and someone said, "Scan again before it disappears completely." New drilling operations began at the depth where the supposed form had been detected. The researchers tried to figure out what they were dealing with: remains of a body, an imprint, a crystalline formation, or something else. But when the next batch of samples was extracted, everything changed. In the center of the ice core was a dark element, too orderly to be a stone and too porous to be bone. Under the microscope, it revealed a complex structure resembling cartilage tissue. This meant that we were not dealing with an imprint, but with actual biomaterial. It was not fully mineralized like a fossil, and this completely confused the dating process. The actual temperature of the layer where the find was located fluctuated around -90 degrees Fahrenheit. This almost rules out any metabolic activity. However, a faint thermal trace was detected near the specimen. No one knew how this was possible. There were many theories: a crystallization reaction, a geothermal pocket, bacterial activity. But none of them explained the completely preserved tissue structure. At that moment, one of the geologists uttered for the first time a phrase that would be repeated again and again: "This is not a trace of the past, this is perhaps a trace of the present." And although there was still no evidence that the organism was active, the very fact of the specimen's condition meant one thing: the Earth still holds secrets that science is not yet ready to answer. And among them are not just questions about survival, but perhaps about observing us. Lake Vostok has long been known as a unique subglacial formation, isolated from the surface for more than 10 million years. At about 3 miles deep, it is an ecosystem that has not come into contact with the outside world since the time of the dinosaurs. It is here, according to some scientists, that organisms long thought to be extinct may have survived. In 2011, Russia officially announced the successful drilling down to Lake Vostok. At that time, unique forms of microbial life were discovered in water samples, but some of the reports were never published, and the experiments were soon put on hold. Officially, this was due to environmental risks. Now attention has once again turned to Vostok because new scans have revealed that beneath one of the ice sheets there is something shaped like a ridge, a giant winding line stretching deep into the lake. Scientists debated. It could be a geological formation, but when compared to the shapes of cartilage and vertebrae in modern cetaceans, the resemblance was eerily precise. That's when the idea of launching an under-ice drone emerged. The mission was secret and almost no one knew about it. But one of the engineers involved in the project later anonymously recounted, "We saw a shadow, it moved, we couldn't find it again, but I remember how it looked into the camera." When the first images from the under-ice cameras and microscopic tissue photos began to appear, the scientific community became divided. Some considered it a sensation, while others called it a blatant fabrication. But the very fact that the discussion was taking place behind closed doors and was not allowed into the mainstream press spoke volumes. Paleontologists with experience working on marine reptiles expressed cautious interest. The tissue structure resembled known specimens of mosasaurs, but with differences that suggested a possible lateral offshoot of the evolutionary branch. The question was not whether such a creature had existed, but how it could have been preserved in such an untouched state. Biologists from Arctic programs immediately drew a parallel with the discoveries of well-preserved mammoths in the permafrost of Siberia. There, they had found not only skin and fur, but even blood in a semi-liquid state. And if this is possible with mammals, could a similar scenario exist with marine predators? One of the scientists stated, "This is a discovery that could change our understanding of extinction as a phenomenon. Perhaps some species did not go extinct at all, but simply went into hibernation for millions of years." This phrase quickly disappeared from the meeting transcript, and he never repeated such words again. Meanwhile, geochemists discovered that in the area where the trace was found, there was an increased concentration of methane and hydrogen sulfide, a gas that can form both as a result of organic decomposition and from biological activity. The second possibility would be impossible unless this creature was at least partially alive. The paradox was that the more data came in, the less information became available to the public. Dozens of publications were removed, forums were shut down, and scientific articles were retracted. People who had published photos and reports either retracted their statements or disappeared from the public eye. The most high-profile disappearance was that of a biologist from France who had worked on the International Subglacial Mission. After publishing a report on probable tissue activity, she flew out to a conference and was never seen again. Her colleagues claimed that she had gone on an extended leave, but she never got in touch again, neither in personal nor in scientific circles. At major universities where this discovery was discussed, the discussions began to take place off the record. All documents were delivered in person, printed out, and stored without any digital copies. This resembled the working conditions of secret laboratories more than those of open science. One of the journalists investigating the case noticed an interesting pattern. The closer a person was to the actual analysis of the samples, the sooner they lost interest in the subject, as if something had been explained to them, or they had been threatened, or shown something that compelled them to remain silent. While the official press wrote about a reassessment of the data, something entirely different was happening behind the scenes. Someone very influential wanted to make sure this discovery did not become public knowledge, at least not yet. Despite the silence of official bodies, one laboratory in southern Chile, independent and private, managed to obtain a copy of the samples, which had been passed on through unofficial channels. Their team began to study the tissue in secret. The results exceeded even the boldest expectations. The composition of the tissue indicated incredible resilience. It contained proteins resistant to extreme temperature fluctuations, as well as traces of lipids typical of animals capable of prolonged anabiosis. Some of these elements are found in deep-sea species that survive under tremendous pressure. But most importantly, structures resembling embryonic cells were discovered within the tissues. This meant that the cells could still divide, not actively, but potentially. The laboratory did not claim that the creature was alive, but they admitted it was not completely dead. This news spread among several independent groups, but the reaction was the same. Everyone demanded that the research be stopped. The reason was the danger of infection by unknown microorganisms. The official explanation sounded logical. But among the scientists, no one was talking about viruses. Everyone was talking about something else. If this really is anabiosis, who knows what will happen if it is interrupted? Cases of cryopreservation in nature have been known for a long time. Frogs, worms, and some species of fish are capable of freezing and then coming back to life months later. But all of them are small organisms. In this case, however, we were talking about a creature that could reach up to 40 feet in length. But Antarctica has a unique phenomenon, zones of geothermal heat located beneath the thick ice. It is precisely in such zones that, theoretically, the existence of liquid water and stable temperatures is possible even when the surface is deeply frozen. If the creature ended up in such a zone already dead, it could have been preserved. If it entered alive, it could have gone into a state of anabiosis. Long-term anabiosis is a rare phenomenon, but it is possible, especially if the organism is initially adapted to extreme conditions. And perhaps it was precisely this that ensured the survival of a species thought to have gone extinct tens of millions of years ago. But there is one but. If the organism had begun to awaken, and all signs pointed to this, it meant that the conditions had changed and not by chance. The final reports compiled from scattered sources painted a troubling picture. Activity beneath the ice was increasing. Data from seismic stations recorded regular micro-movements in the area of Lake Vostok. Thermal sensors indicated a gradual rise in temperature. Just before shutting down, the probe recorded a brief video fragment. The camera entered an area with murky, darkish water. For a split second, a massive shadow appeared. Then the image disappeared. After that, the station was completely shut down. All scientists were evacuated. Access is denied. There is silence in official sources. And now, in classified archives, there lies a case that cannot be made public, because if it is confirmed, humanity will have to face the fact that life on this planet is not only older than we thought, but also smarter, more resilient, and not always dead. Sometimes it simply waits for the ice to crack, and by then it will be too late to pretend that this is just a scientific hypothesis.